Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. We're delighted to have you joining us for the third and final hour of America's Unfinished Business, a summit on LGBTQ plus rights. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Rockefeller Foundation and Philip Morris International, for their support of the program. Our past two sessions featured conversations with some of the most consequential leaders of the LGBTQ plus movement. We're not done yet. Over the next hour, you're going to meet people who've not only excelled in their fields, but also helped to transform public perception and public realities. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at #TheHillLGBTQ. We're broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. And if you experience any trouble with the video, I hear that refreshing the page should mostly fix the problem. Count me as skeptical, but try it anyway. Our first guest spent a good part of 2019 accompanying his husband, former Democratic presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg, on the campaign trail. But even before he became a campaign spouse, Chasten Buttigieg had been an advocate for teachers, inclusion, and the arts. He's also the author of a memoir, I Have Something to Tell You, where he shares his story of growing up gay in his small Midwestern town, his relationship with Pete, and his hope for America's future. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And Chasten, just real quickly, the reason that we're doing this program today in this moment when we've got a pandemic hitting the nation. We have 44 million people officially unemployed, probably a higher number. We had the murder of George Floyd and so many other people, half a block right now from Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. And we had a Supreme Court decision that went the right way on saying, hey, we shouldn't discriminate. But this is a tumultuous time and an inflection point, and you and your husband have been a key part of this inflection point, being really the first major gay candidate, your husband, and the first gay spouse running for the Democratic presidential nomination. I'd just love to hear, how you look at the scene today and this moment from all you've been through and all you've experienced.
Well, what I see right now in this moment is a lot of people standing up and saying enough. We want to be heard and we demand equal rights, whether that's coming from the Supreme Court decision, which was amazing, but also it is still sort of sad that we are celebrating getting basic human rights. Same thing with the Black Lives Matter movement. Many people standing up and saying enough with the brutality and we are deserving of much more in this country. It's the same thing I saw out on the campaign trail with Peter quite often in many different pockets of this country, people feeling unheard, unseen, and untaken care of by the people we've elected to take care of us.
So, I think what you just said is very powerful, that you're, in a way, looking forward to the day when being gay, being lesbian, being transgendered is a normal part of our lives, and we're not having conferences on it. We put out of business the unfinished business.
Yeah. No, absolutely. In a way, watching the Supreme Court make that decision was very heartwarming, especially as a person who is watching our country still grapple, some people in our country, right? Certain politicians grapple with the idea that other people are deserving of basic human rights. And while I'm extremely grateful for that decision for the Supreme Court, I'm also a little frustrated that we still live in a country where people who are elected to take care of Americans are still making decisions based on the idea that some people aren't deserving of as many rights as others.
Look, I think one of the questions I've had over these issues, and I didn't have exactly your experience, but I grew up in an Air Force family, and before I came out, it was complicated. There were, different tensions going on. It was certainly a different era of whether or not I should be paying attention to Washington, D.C. and what it said or not, whether I should be resilient on my own or not. Tell us about your book and the journey you've had, and whether or not you think Washington should be a part of this picture, or should we be resilient and ignore this town?
Well, I grew up in northern Michigan, so I'm not sure how similar the story is to yours, but when I grew up in northern Michigan, the fact was that you just could not be gay. I did not know anyone who was out. I did not know anyone who identified as LGBTQ, and it was a matter of fact that I told myself as a kid growing up that I would lose everything if I were to come out. That's why I ran away from home when I did. And I just grew up in a society, in a bubble that told me something about myself was twisted and wrong. What would have made a huge difference for me is looking up to Washington and seeing leaders in positions of power saying that nothing about me was twisted, nothing about me was wrong, that I was just fine the way that I was. And I was deserving of equal rights, deserving of love. And the fact is, I didn't grow up in that time. And we still are living in a time when many queer people around the country are looking to Washington, looking up to people in positions of power and wondering if they truly get it. And if there even is a place for them in this country. It's what our campaign was about, is about belonging. And it's why I wrote the book, because there are still so many kids who I met on the campaign trail who had very similar stories to mine, who are wondering if they still even fit, if they belong in this country. I wanted to share my story in a way that I hope is helpful to other queer people, probably in a very different way than most people who write a political memoir. I also wanted it to be funny and awkward because I never got to read books about queer people growing up, or what it's like to fall in love with for the first time, or what it's like to grow up in communities and bubbles that tell you you don't fit. And I just thought it was time to put that story on the page. But I'm glad we're having this opportunity to chat today, because we need to continue to have these conversations and continue to put out those stories, because the fact is we're just not there yet.
Look, the reason I asked our team to organize this conference and I reached out to you was I saw this moment as a time of fragile rights about race, about gender, LGBTQ rights, their rights to adopt children, their rights on healthcare, their rights to serve the nation. And a lot of this had seemed like conquered territory before. This is before the Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court decision caught me a little off guard. I reached out to you because I sort of felt like we need to remind people that this is a time of fragile rights. And even with the vice president, whom Mayor Pete, your husband, and you are supporting right now, I remembered to the day, in fact, I saw him that day when he accidentally said that we should support same-sex marriage before his president was ready to go there. That was perhaps an accidental, perhaps a non-accidental moment. That was fragile at that moment as well. And so I'm interested, Chasten, in how you think this fragility can be removed and how we can conquer the territory and have it done for a while.
Yeah, so, I know that there are a lot of people who have opinions about, folks who have and who have not come around on this issue. For me, what helps me stay focused, stay driven, and frankly, stay motivated in this moment is just doing the work. And I'm grateful that the vice president was so vocal about his opinion then, and I'm grateful for all of the growth that has happened since then. I am more worried about people who spend their time policing other people's queerness, their identity, and making other people feel that they don't belong in this community, or that there is a right way and a wrong way to exist, especially when so many people right now are questioning whether they should even exist. I met many of those kids and young people, even people twice my age on the campaign trail, who drove 8 hours to come see Peter and I because they were terrified someone in their own town might spot them at a Pete for America or event, or kids who had to whisper in my ear in front of their family that they couldn't come out. They felt unsafe to come out because of the communities they were living in. It has always been fragile. It just depends on how much of your privilege has gotten in the way of you seeing what's happening to other people. And as a queer person growing up in this country, it has always been known to me just how fragile it was for me to even exist in the company of other people. But when you think about the 40% of homeless kids on the street today who identify as LGBTQIA, or you think about the violence that is continuously happening to Black trans women around this country, you see that we are so far. We have so far to go, and that it has always been very unstable in this community. And I think many people want to believe that because we were granted the right to marry, that everything is just fine. Well, the right to marry wasn't necessarily the goal for everyone in this community, and I believe that until everyone in this community has equal rights, it's up to the rest of us to continue speaking up, especially those who have more privilege than others.
I really appreciate that. I had a conversation earlier in today's program with Amit Paley, who's head of the Trevor Project, and I think he was in law school with your husband. Amit is very powerful at understanding and being able to communicate about the anguish that young people feel, and the bullying and the challenges to their mental health. And you've become a celebrity. There's just no doubt about it. How do you stay in touch? Because I hear you talk. It's one of the things I found very compelling about you. You become a person, you've got a spouse who's, famous in the political world, but you become this person who somehow kind of connects with the anguish people feel. And I'm interested in how you maintain that.
Well, that's
I know
been
it's
a
an
weird
odd question, but I am interested.
it's been a weird transition over the year. You know, when I came out on the campaign trail with Pete, I wanted to be as helpful as possible. I was never political. I never considered myself very political. And I started just telling my story on the campaign trail and opening up about my vulnerabilities and my experiences growing up in northern Michigan, running away from home and what that felt like. The few nights I slept in the back of my car, being a suicidal teenager, wondering what it would ever feel like to be in love or to have the right to marry or have children in this country. And the more I spent time on the campaign trail just telling those stories that I had locked up for so long because I thought they were maybe embarrassing or too vulnerable, I started to realize that, these aren't unique to me. These are uniquely American. So many people have stories similar to mine. And I think that is what helped me connect with a lot of people out in the campaign, is that anguish, that pain, that fear, the confusion about whether or not this country stands for you, whether or not people who are elected into office are going to go to Washington and fight for you. And that's why I spent as much time on the campaign trail as possible. And I loved, touring LGBTQ centers and touring homeless service providers. I toured over 100 centers while I was out on the campaign trail because that was very personal to me. That was part of my story. And I wanted to make sure that people knew where our campaign stood, where my husband stood, and what I would do for them as first gentleman, not only as, my husband as president, but that is how I felt most fulfilled at the end of the day, was continuing to share that story and continuing to show up and see people. I think that is sort of the crux of what is needed right now, is people to continue showing up. Showing up can be many different things. It can be tutoring, mentorship, donating, but you have to show up and actually do the work. And that's why I went out on the campaign trail, because that's what I felt like was the work. It's not enough to just sit behind your Twitter handle or be on social media getting angry. It's very easy to be angry on social media, but you got to go out there and actually do something with it.
One of the things I did before today, just to kind of ground myself, is I went back and I saw a couple of videos of the Stonewall riots and the first gay pride parade. And everyone was there, and the transgendered community was leading this in a way. The Black transgendered community was leading it. And it's something I've talked with a number of people today about, whether the LGBT community has been a fair and inclusive community itself, whether it is identified and understood that whereas gay white men like me have secured a lot of rights, whether that has been something that I have been equally concerned about others on the other side of the spectrum on this. And I'm just interested in your scale, if you will, or how you think about we can ourselves be more introspective with our responsibilities and also our salute to people who helped start this rights cause long ago.
Absolutely. I appreciate you bringing that up. And I think many people in our community fail to recognize that your rights, your and our rights, this community's rights were won because of the activism of trans women of color. And in a time in our country when trans women of color are continuously under attack, left out from our community, it is up to us. I appreciate that you use the word privilege too, that we have to use our privilege to benefit other people in our community. You even see in many pride parades around the country where trans activists are being left out or not even listened to. So we got to think about who we're even inviting to the table when we talk about our community, because I think sometimes our community likes to really focus on the G in that acronym. And when I was out on the campaign trail, I spent a lot of time with trans activists in the trans community. And some of the hardest stories I heard were from trans teenagers who were pushed out of their homes, who were, sort of living in halfway homes. They had aged out of the foster care system. They were trying to find employment, but employers were discriminating against them, not allowing them to come to work dressed as the gender of their identity. And you just think about the simple fact that I can throw on a baseball cap and go to the store and I'm none the wiser, or people are none the wiser. But for many people in our community, that's just simply not the fact. I can go to my place of employment and blend in different ways that trans Americans can't. And there's still just so much work to be done in this community. And I think especially right now during Pride, It is, yes, a time to celebrate our existence, because for many of us, including me, who thought we would never make it, this far, we would never be alive. It's also a time for us to give credit to the brave trans women, especially trans women of color, who stood up for me. You know, there's people sticking up for me around this country who don't even know me. And I think that's part of the work as well, is continuing to stick up for people you might not even know, people you might even disagree with, but under the belief that we are all deserving of equal rights in this community. And it's just a fact that we all don't have them right now.
Well, I'm going to actually be discussing that very subject with our next guest, Yvonne Field Stewart, in a moment, founder of the Okra Project, on that.
Oh, great.
And she's terrific. Before I close, though, I want to do two things. First, I hope Buddy and Truman are good. I hope they're well. And I also just want you to send our best regards to your spouse, whom I had speak when I was at the Atlantic. He spoke for me in Des Moines, Iowa. I'll never forget when he drove down, and I said, wow, that guy ought to think about running for president someday. But just give us a real quick snapshot, if you would, of your book. I Have Something to Tell You, and just give us what you think the key zinger highlights that you want to share with our audience before they buy it in September.
Sure. I suppose, you know, in a way, I watched a lot of people write stories about me, and they had ideas about who I was. I wanted to make sure that I could tell my story in my own way. I also wanted to do it in a way that was hopefully relatable and funny and down to earth. I want people to feel like we're just, you know, grabbing a drink or a coffee, and I'm just sharing stories about what it was like growing up in Northern Michigan, what it was like, you know, all the way up until meeting Pete. Our stories are very different. I was a first-generation college student. There were a lot of bumps and hurdles along the way, a lot of heartbreak. I get pretty open about, you know, some of those vulnerabilities throughout my life. And then, you know, it takes a turn, and I fall in love with the mayor, and his life changes dramatically. And I'm kind of thrown into the blender of what it's like to be a political spouse. And I hope it pulls back the curtain for a lot of people, and they see just what that role is, and how I tried to shape it in my own way, and just give people maybe a different idea of who this person is that maybe they got to know on the campaign trail. And hopefully, in a way, you know, it helps queer people, especially young queer people, read a story that I know I didn't get to read growing up.
Well, I want to thank you. What a privilege to talk for you, and thank you for sharing your insights with us today. And I hope this is the first of many encounters. But Chasten Buttigieg, thank you very much, and good luck with your and your husband's current political efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much.